The Six-Day War was the war which changed the face of the Middle East. In 6 days, Israel destroyed the armies of the three most threatening and most dangerous of the Arab states on its borders, namely Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. No longer could they wipe Israel off the face of the earth and drive all the Jews into the sea. It had only been 19 years since the State of Israel was declared by David Ben-Gurion on the 14th of May 1948. Israel had survived the attacks of its neighbors, brought in over 900,000 refugees from Arab countries, and begun building a modern state. The culture shock for both the European-centered culture of the Yishuv and for the new immigrants was huge. There had been years of austerity, and 1966 saw the country in a recession with a weak government led by the uncharismatic Levi Eshkol. In early May 1967, the first rumblings of the impending war began to appear. The Syrians had since 1964 been diverting the water of the Chatzbani River, which was the main source of water for the Sea of Galilee, Lake Kinneret, and Israel's national water carrier. In April, the Syrians sent fighter planes into the sky. In the resulting air battle, Israel shot down 6 Syrian planes without losing any of its own. However, it was not until President Nasser of Egypt, a former army general, upped the ante that events began to head towards war. Nasser had led a military coup which overthrew the regime of King Farouk in 1952. In 1956, he was elected with 99.95% of the votes. His name was the only one on the ballot, and Abdel Gamal Nasser became the first president of the Republic of Egypt. It is important to understand the confluence of events, particularly in May 1967, the month immediately preceding the outbreak of war. The Cold War between the USSR, Soviet Russia, and the USA was at its peak, and each considered the Middle East a great battlefield for testing their latest weaponry. The Russians, for example, had issued the Egyptian Air Force with the latest MiG fighter planes. The Syrian border had become problematic, with the Syrians regularly shelling the settlements below the Golan Heights. In addition, the Fatah terrorist group had attempted several infiltrations. The Israeli government threatened to overthrow the Syrian regime if the attacks and infiltrations from Syrian territory did not cease. By May, the border was hot, and on May the 13th and 14th, the Russians disseminated disinformation to the Egyptians that Israel was about to launch an attack on Syria. As a result, Egypt began mobilizing thousands of troops around the Suez Canal. Although Nasser soon discovered there was no Israeli buildup of forces, he continued massing troops, and on May the 14th moved forces into the Sinai and demanded that the UN remove its troops, which had been stationed as a buffer guard to Israel. On May 18th, only 3 days after Nasser's demand that the UN troops be removed, the UN Secretary General U Tant agreed to the Egyptian demand and ordered the removal of UNEF, United Nations Emergency Force. The repercussions of this decision have had a major impact on Israeli defense policy ever since, never to rely on foreign protection. The focus of attention now became the Straits of Tiran. Israeli Prime Minister Levi Eshkol repeated the declarations that Israel had made after the Sinai campaign of 1956, saying that the closure of the Straits would be an act of war. On May the 22nd, Egypt responded by saying that the Straits would be closed to all ships flying Israeli flags or carrying strategic materials with effect from May the 23rd. Nasser also announced, falsely, that the Straits had been mined. 90% of Israeli oil passed through the Straits to reach Eilat at the southern tip of the country. All tankers due to pass through the Straits were now delayed. The third border, which was a real threat to Israel, was its border with Jordan. At its narrowest point, at the central part of the country, the border was 14 miles wide, and the danger of the country being cut in half by an invading Jordanian army concerned the Israelis immensely. Israel called upon Jordan to refrain from joining hostilities, but King Hussein got caught up in the wave of pan-Arab nationalism and was to join the war, a decision that was to cost him dearly. In addition, Jerusalem, Israel's political, religious, and emotional capital, was divided between East and West. The holiest shrine in Jewish religion, the Kotel, the Temple Mount, also known as the Wailing Wall, lay in East Jerusalem, Jews were not given access to pray at the wall. Thus, by the end of May, the area was clearly headed towards war, and Israel would have to fight on 3 separate fronts. As the country headed for war, the lack of a charismatic, dynamic leadership was evident when on the 25th of May, Prime Minister Levi Eshkol addressed the nation, leaving people in serious doubt whether the country would survive the inevitable forthcoming war. On June the 1st, in order to placate public opinion, Moshe Dayan was appointed Minister of Defense and a unity government was put in place. At 7 a.m. on June the 5th, 1967, 200 planes of the Israeli Air Force were in the air. Within 4 hours, 2/3 of the Egyptian Air Force was destroyed, most of them while still on the ground. Israel had had intelligence that the Egyptians swapped pilots at exactly 7 a.m. every morning. Israel sent a message to Jordan to stay out of the war. The Jordanians replied by shelling West Jerusalem, reaching as far as Tel Aviv. Syrian planes attempted to bomb Haifa, but were repelled. Israel was drawn into a war on all 3 fronts. Israel destroyed both the Syrian and Jordanian air forces, ensuring total air dominance over the whole area. The focus of the second day of the war, June the 6th, was the Sinai and the destruction of the Egyptian army. Major tank battles took place in the Sinai. The superiority of the American-supplied tanks over the Russian tanks used by the Egyptians once again proved that the Americans had better weapons in the air and on the ground. Most of Sinai was captured, including Sharm el-Sheikh, and the Straits of Tiran were once again open to Israeli shipping. Also on the second day of the war, Israeli forces captured Mount Scopus in Jerusalem. Israel was especially careful not to bomb the Old City and endanger the holy sites of Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. On the third day, June the 7th, Israeli forces focused on the Eastern Front. The main battle in Jerusalem took place on Ammunition Hill. The Old City was taken, and the famous words of General Mordechai Motor Gul, Har HaBayit B'Yadeinu, the Temple Mount is in our hands, were recorded for posterity. The rest of the West Bank, including Hebron and other major cities, were captured. Jews of all persuasions flocked through the Old City, attempting to reach the Kotel and be amongst the first to pray at the wall for over 2,000 years. The outpouring of emotion showed quite clearly that the chances of ever redividing Jerusalem would probably never take place again. The fourth day, June the 8th, focused on the imminent ceasefire that the Arab states and Russia were desperate to put in place. But Israel had not finished the work of ensuring that it had removed all the imminent threats. The West Bank ceasefire lines were pushed back, and the width between the desert and the sea was now 44 miles in place of the 14 just 3 days earlier. In the south, the ceasefire line was established at the Suez Canal. In the north, the Syrians continued its bombardment of the civilian settlements below the Golan Heights. On day 5, Nasser appeared on TV for the first time. He admitted defeat and resigned. However, the following day, he retracted his resignation. Now that Egypt and Jordan were defeated, Israel could focus the full force of the IDF on the Golan Heights. The Golan Heights were considered an almost impregnable area, overlooking the Sea of Galilee and stretching to Mount Hermon in the north. During the early 1960s, Israeli spy Eli Cohen had been taken on a tour of the fortifications of the Syrian army on the heights. He had suggested that trees should be planted where the fortified bunkers existed to provide the soldiers some shade when they exited for breaks. This provided the Israeli attacking forces with perfect markers where the troops defending the Golan were hidden. Without Eli Cohen's intelligence, Israeli casualties would have been extremely high during the attack to take the heights. At 11:30 a.m. on the 5th day of the war, the attack began. By the end of the day, all the roads leading up to the heights were in Israeli hands. The high ground was to be conquered the following day, the 6th day of the war, 10th of June, and the road to Damascus was open. Israel had no intention on driving onto the Syrian capital. The war was now over. The 6-day war changed Israel forever. In fact, it changed the face of the Middle East forever as well. Israel had pushed its borders back to what was considered manageable distance on all 3 sides, a strategic depth for defense, as it was called. This false sense of security was exposed 6 years later when Israel came close to being overwhelmed and defeated in the 1973 Yom Kippur War. Meanwhile, the feelings of relief impacted the nation and the whole Jewish world as well. But this sense of relief soon changed into a sense of glorification. Israelis began visiting ancient Jewish historical sites in places like Hebron and Jericho. Israelis believed that they had dealt the strongest Arab armies a humiliating defeat from which they would take decades to recover. This arrogant shechtzanut attitude was to prove another important element in the future catastrophe of 1973. The UN passed Resolution 242, calling on Israel to withdraw from all conquered territory in return for the right to live in peace. 242 is still in place, awaiting to be implemented, although peace treaties have been signed with Egypt and Jordan. To this very day, we feel the impact of the Six-Day War.